Once upon a time, in the small town of Willowville, there was a quaint little bakery called Sweet Delights. It was a place where sugary aromas wafted through the air and scrumptious pastries lined the shelves. I, Alex Wilson, a 28-year-old aspiring writer, had the pleasure of working there part-time to support my passion for storytelling. Little did I know that my encounters with entitled parents would soon become the inspiration for one of my greatest tales. One sunny morning, as I stepped into Sweet Delights, a gust of wind swept through the door, bringing with it a whiff of adventure. The bell chimed cheerfully, signaling my entrance. I greeted my coworker, Sarah, a bubbly 25-year-old woman who shared my love for baking. Together, we formed a formidable team, tackling the daily demands of our bakery. But on this fateful day, the scent of freshly baked cinnamon rolls wasn't the only thing that filled the air. Enter Karen, the embodiment of entitlement, accompanied by her rambunctious child, Ethan. Karen, a woman in her late 30s, had a permanent scowl etched on her face, and Ethan, a mischievous 7-year-old, seemed to have inherited his mother's disposition. I couldn't help but overhear their conversation as they approached the counter. "Karen, excuse me, we demand to be served immediately." Sarah, ever the professional, maintained her composure. "Of course, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Karen, "I want a dozen chocolate cupcakes with extra sprinkles, and I want them for free." I couldn't help but roll my eyes at her audacity. I decided to step in and offer my assistance. "Alex, good morning, ma'am. I'm Alex, the baker. I'd be happy to help you with your cupcake order. However, I'm afraid we can't offer them for free." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she glared at me with disdain. "Who do you think you are, young man? How dare you deny my special privileges? I demand to see your manager." Ah, the infamous demand for the manager. It was as predictable as the sunrise. "Alex, I assure you, ma'am, the manager won't change our policy. But if you'd like, I can go check." Karen huffed impatiently. "Yes, go fetch your manager. I'll have you fired for this." I couldn't resist a sarcastic remark as I turned to leave. Oh, I'm quaking in my apron. As I returned with our store manager, Mr. Thompson, I couldn't help but smirk. Mr. Thompson was known for his no-nonsense attitude, and dealing with entitled customers was his specialty. Karen's face lit up as she saw him approaching. Finally, someone who knows how to treat customers. Mr. Thompson listened patiently to Karen's tirade before calmly explaining our store policy. It was like watching a masterclass in customer service. But Karen, being the epitome of entitlement, was not one to be reasoned with. "Karen, this is ridiculous. I demand to speak to the owner." Ah, the owner, Mrs. Lewis, a feisty woman who had built Sweet Delights from scratch. She had a soft spot for her employees and was well known for her no-nonsense attitude. Sensing an opportunity to put Karen in her place, I decided to take the lead. "Alex, well, Karen, it just so happens that I'm Mrs. Lewis's nephew. She's not fond of entitled customers like yourself. Shall I give her a call?" Karen's face turned red and her voice rose to a shrill pitch. "You can't do this. This is discrimination." Before Karen could escalate the situation any further, Mrs. Lewis herself appeared from the back room. Her steely gaze met Karen's frantic one, and I could almost see the sparks flying between them. "Mrs. Lewis, what seems to be the problem here?" Karen, sensing her imminent defeat, unleashed her fury. She lunged towards me, her hands flailing wildly. In her rage, she failed to notice the swift intervention of Mrs. Lewis, who expertly restrained her. "Mrs. Lewis, that's enough, Karen. You've caused enough trouble in my bakery." Karen's attempt to physically attack me had failed, and the look of defeat on her face was priceless. As she was escorted out of the bakery, I couldn't help but quip, remember. "Karen, the customer is always right, unless they're entitled." The incident with Karen became a legendary tale in the town of Willowville, and Sweet Delights became known as the fortress of sanity against entitled parents. As for me, I continued to work at the bakery, spinning tales and turning moments into stories. The experience taught me that even in the most unexpected places, stories worth telling can unfold, and sometimes The villains get their just desserts. And so, dear readers, remember to sprinkle a bit of sarcasm and humor into your everyday encounters. You never know when a story might emerge from the most entitled of situations, and how it might inspire others to stand up against the tyrants of entitlement. This is a story about my grandparents' friend. I was a young teen, but given the outcome, this story has stuck with me. I've sat on this story for a while, but it's so satisfying, so I figured I'd share. For the sake of this story, we will call my grandparents' friend William. Now, my grandparents knew William from way back. My grandmother knew him from school, and my grandfather met him after marrying my grandmother. Anyways, in the 60s, Grandma was a manager at 7-Eleven. William led a crew that went there every day. It was the only gas station in a 30-minute radius, so everyone knew everyone in that sleepy coastal town kind of way. Now, one day, William was doing a job down on the waterfront and slipped, fell, and broke his back. While he was healing from the operation and was broke as a joke, my grandma would always make sure to send him something to eat that she'd pay for when the crew would come in to grab their snacks and gas up, knowing William would simply skip the meal to save the money for his own family. My grandpa also took him to several doctor appointments since William couldn't drive for a while and his tiny little wife couldn't wrangle him into a car by herself. William never forgot that. 20 years later, when he sold off his now very successful business and was a millionaire about 20 times over, he promptly told 90% of the world to go to hell but kept those that had always been there for him close. Meanwhile, he never moved from the house that he'd had since before he was rich. His only concessions to his wealth were trips with his wife to see the world and buying up quite a few acres of the forested land around him. If you weren't his friend, you'd take him for every other blue-collar worker in the town. There was absolutely nothing obvious to show that he was worth tens of millions of dollars. After his wife died in the 90s, William decided to take up a new hobby. As he lived outside of the city limits, he set up a sawmill and woodworking shop, got all the proper permits and everything. The saws were in a big, old, enclosed building in the middle of all that land, so in all honesty, so no harm, no foul. Right, wrong. The family that owned the forest behind William's land had just sold it to developers. Thus, the new luxury-gated neighborhood, the first in the area, was born. Enter a plethora of Chads and Karens who were mostly from up north and had moved down south to take advantage of the better weather and the nearby beach. It didn't take long before they decided to take offense to his little business venture on the other side of the 10-foot-tall wall of their neighborhood because it didn't fit with the image of their community. You know, the community he was decidedly not a part of. So, they sued him, didn't even try to start a dialogue with him, just up and sued him. William was livid. He was your typical coastal redneck, and he would be damned if those Yankees told him what to do on his own property. That was not within city limits nor located in an HOA. William countered with professional noise studies that showed that some of the kids in that neighborhood drove vehicles that made more ambient noise than his little operation. Nope, the people in the neighborhood simply threw more money at the lawyers to continue on with the lawsuit. Essentially, their plan was to bleed him dry. Their lawyers, who were not locals, actually told William's lawyer that he should probably advise his client to close the shop so that he wouldn't end up bankrupt due to the resources being thrown at him from the homeowner. Due to the relatively modest surroundings of his home, the neighbors nor their lawyers had any idea the man was actually richer than just about all of them put together. All they saw was an older dude who drove a beat-up 80s model truck and wore Dickies jeans and work shirts that lived in what appeared to be a relatively modest home, especially compared to their McMansion. When William's lawyer told him about that conversation, William lost his mind. I clearly remember him screeching into my parents' driveway in that old work truck, cussing up a storm and ranting and raving before he even got in the house. He came to our house. Why? Because my grandmother, bless her heart, was known as one of the most giving people in the world, unless you got her angry. If you hurt her or someone she cared for, she became one of the most vindictive people that could be found in that town. I am not kidding when I say that her ability for revenge served cold was legendary amongst the local. So, William had come to the house for a dose of her deviousness. U.S. kids weren't allowed inside during that conversation, but after he left that day, I later heard the adults talking about how he proceeded to hire quite a few private investigators to see if there would be any dirt to dig up on them. By them, I mean the dozens of people in that neighborhood that were a part of that lawsuit. Lo and behold, there were apparently copious amounts of dirt to be had. I still remember him positively crowing about it to my grandparents one fine summer day, months later. That 60-something-year-old man was as gleeful as the proverbial kid on Christmas morning. Why? Because after he learned what his little private army dug up, he started making some phone calls to various acquaintances in high places. The ensuing fallout meant that the lawsuit was dropped. There was quite a list of misdeeds that were discovered, but the ones that I heard talked about by the adults that stick out, there were more than a handful of individuals that owed back child support. William very helpfully had the private investigators provide the mother's updated address and employment information so that they could pursue said child support garnishment if they wanted to. On top of that, the IRS became very interested in several of those people as well as various other neighbors. Finally, one household ended up in prison because the investigators realized that they were drug dealers. The pictures of the transactions caught by the PIs were helpfully handed over to the sheriff's department. Drugs are bad, kids. Moral of the story: never get a rich redneck angry. Male, 29, living in Chicago. So, my mother and father have been going through a divorce for over 5 years. My dad has the money, my mom does not, and it seems to be going on for so long because they cannot come to a settlement number. My mom thinks she deserves half of his money even though she signed a prenup agreement. Fast forward to today, my mom has used a good chunk of her own money on this divorce case and is now bringing me into the mix. She has been using 2 credit cards under my name and says she needs my help with this case and I need to do this because I'm her son and I only have one mother. With these 2 credit cards, there is currently $10,000 in debt due to lawyer fees. But this is all under my name, my social and my credit report. I initially said I would help her with 1 credit card cause I understand this is a tough situation, but we have 2 open cause she recently opened the second one without telling me. So there's that. Every time I mention she needs to start paying more off, she gets very defensive and turn around the argument on me saying, "Your father is trying to kill me and you're going to just sit there and let him do that?" This situation has given me a lot of anxiety, as my mom has constantly tried to pin me against my dad in this situation. She said I should have no contact with him at all during this and that I should only be on her side. In about 2-3 years, I'm looking to buy a house with my girlfriend, and I'm very worried that my mom, with her back against the wall, could do something detrimental to my credit. 2 credit cards, $10,000 in debt, and 1 credit card opened behind my back. At what point do I have to take family out of the situation and look at it from a human-to-human lens? I really need some advice as this is a very complicated situation, but I do feel I need to do what's best for me without feeling guilty. Would really appreciate some advice from this group.